Indie Beacon Radio with host B. Alan Bourgeois. Welcome to Indie Beacon Radio, where creative souls can find help in marketing their creations. You can send questions for each show on Twitter using the hashtag IndieBeacon. Now sit back and enjoy learning about our guest for this show.
All right. And welcome to another episode of Indie Beacon Show. This is your host, Alan Bourgeois, and I have with me today John Noble. Welcome, John.
Hey there.
So you have an interesting past that we're going to get into because it explains why you're writing the books and stuff. As a young person, you had issues with English and actually didn't feel comfortable, if I understood correctly, in a big school with a lot of kids because the English classes were going a little slower than you might have liked or something. Was that about right?
Oh, well, so what happened is kind of stupid. I grew up in really small town America. It was a town of like 5,000 people. And when I graduated 8th grade, we moved to a big Dallas-Fort Worth area school. So I went from a school where there were, 60 people in the grade and I knew everybody, to a school where there were, I think there were 660 in my graduating class, and there were more that started out and didn't make it all the way through. And the counselor there suggested that I should take the normal English class. And so I thought, oh, okay, well, I didn't know any better at the time. What I discovered later was that was a huge mistake. I should have gotten on the advanced track English class. I did the next year, but my freshman year at school, I ended up just kind of sitting there in class because there was nothing to do. And one of the dirty secrets about normal classes is that a lot of the kids don't want to be there. It feels like sometimes the teachers don't want to teach. There's lots of problems, not to throw shade on anyone, I guess, but yeah, it was there wasn't a lot going on, so I just started writing. It was actually, I had some friends back in my old town who'd been trying to write fan fiction, and so I just started out. I'd originally tried to write fan fiction for Stargate, if you know what that is. Mm-hmm. And that didn't really work out, so I just started writing my own stuff. And yeah, I just started writing and kept on writing. And all of a sudden, 10 years later, it's 12 years later, I think. It's a lot of years later. I ended up here, so.
And it was an interesting road on how you got to that point, because you ended up in college and you continue to write different stories and things of that nature, but nothing really stuck until the book, The Days of Elijah, came along, which was simply by a conversation that was going on with people you knew. So explain a little more about that.
Yeah, so what happened was The Days of Elijah was actually what I consider to be my 10th book that I wrote. Before that, I wrote a really, really bad sci-fi fantasy series that I never finished for good reason. And then I also wrote an actually not too bad epic fantasy series that at some point I'm going to go back and actually retool and put out there. I just haven't at the time. And The Days of Elijah kind of came up. I was basically like at a church group with some people. And one guy, I was kind of frustrated at the time. I'd been having a lot of personal issues in my own life. And I asked the guy how I could serve God with my writing, and he had no clue. I was like, well, that's great, thanks. And then he raised this weird question. I don't know why he was thinking about Elijah, which I don't know how much you know about Elijah. He's just a prophet from the Bible that I feel is oftentimes, after having written the book, I feel doesn't get isn't as talked about as perhaps he should be. And so he just asked me, like, I wonder what things were like for Elijah. And it got me thinking. I was like, I wonder too. And I started looking into it, and I realized that it was one of those things. I don't know how familiar you are with biblical literature, but like all sorts of people have books written about them. And for some reason, very few people write anything about Elijah. I was like, well, I'll write something about it. And so I wrote something about it. And I don't know. I felt like this was the thing that I was supposed to be doing, which in my view, it was like, God's calling me to do this. And so I did it. And all of a sudden, I wrote it really quickly too. Most of the time it takes me about a year to write a book, but in this case, it was about 4 months. And yeah, I spent the next probably year actually figuring out how to publish it, which that was a journey in and of itself, because turns out the self-publishing part is probably the hardest part of actually self-publishing.
Yes, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I want to go back to the fact that on your website, you actually apologize up front about the inaccuracies that may exist in the book for historical purposes, because you found it a challenge to, one, talk about an ancient history that's clearly on the other side of the world. What kind of stuff did you do to make it more historical or more accurate?
Well, so I've always been interested in history all the way, geez, back to, I don't know, like even almost elementary school. I always loved history. And one of the things that I've consistently learned about history is that you start out with these, big picture ideas. Like you read the history of World War II, and at first you're like Nazis in America. And then you start reading a bit more and you're like, Nazis, England, Soviet Union in America, and Japan. And then you read a little bit more, and every time you learn more, it kind of redefines what you know about something. And so for me, it's always been learning more and more about the historical context. And so one of the things I realized when I got to the end was I tried to research as best I could, but the reality is, in that case, you're talking about something 2,800 years ago. And quite bluntly, most of the historical evidence, that part of the world has been rebuilt, razed to the ground at least 4 or 5 times since then. So a lot of the actual archaeological evidence is gone. A lot of the just in general, a lot of the historical evidence isn't there that we'd like. It's not like today where everything's documented and you can pull up a video of something. Instead, we're making patchy guesswork based off, tablets that we find that sometimes have, trivial minutia data. Like if you go to ancient Egypt, you can find tablets that talk about minor lawsuits between 2 people, which is fascinating, but at the same time doesn't really tell you what it's like to be there or what the people are like. And that there's just such a scattering in the record. And so I, as someone who was acutely aware at the time of just how complex the history was, I don't know, I felt like the first thing I should do is warn people that the reality is there's so much about the period that we'll probably never know, and it's kind of a shame. But when you live in the modern world, you really can't avoid coloring things based on your own perception, right?
So we have just a couple minutes left of this segment. If you would, please tell people what the book is really about.
So the book itself is basically it's a retelling of the story of Elijah. I guess you call it a fictionalized version. I tried to, because basically the only real account of Elijah that we have is the account that's found in the Bible, in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. And so I took that as my baseline information and then tried to supplement all of that with historical information. But it's basically telling that story, but expanded out to a full book length. In the original version, it's, I don't know, a couple thousand words. I tried to expand it, explore the characters themselves, what they were going through. Like, you're standing there trying to confront a king. What does that actually feel like? Because it doesn't really talk about that. There's not space, and no one wrote that down. But I try to explore a lot of things like that, what the story would have meant to the people that were actually living it at the time, and how it would have impacted them. And
so you're in the historical aspect, but you were also making it a little bit flexible as you told the story.
to some extent, yes. I mean, in my view, I tried to stick to the highest level of historical validity that I could, which was to incorporate the actual dialogue from the story, which in ancient times, even in ancient Koine Greek, they didn't have quotation marks, so it's kind of a meaningless thing to do. But I felt like that was as close to the record as I could get, and so I tried to start from there and then just fill in with what I knew about the period and what I could dig up about the period, which was an endlessly fascinating rabbit hole in and of itself. So.
Okay. Well, we're at that time where we need to stop for our sponsors, let them do their thing. We'll be right back.
I'm Rox Berkey.
And I'm Charles Brakefield. We're award-winning co-authors, Brakefield and Berkey, of the Enigma book series. There are 10 books in the series, with book number 11 planned for release in January 2020.
Each story has a central technology focus ranging from identity theft to cryptocurrency and now AI wars. These adult techno thrillers pit cyber good guys against cyber thugs across the darknet.
In our world, technology is today's weapon of choice. You can enjoy ebook format, paper, or Audible. We want your feedback.
Until the next story, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, hello there, my friends. My name is Randy James, independent voiceover producer in the Dallas, Texas area, available to write and record a 30-second commercial, much like the one you're hearing right now. It's a great way to help increase awareness and exposure to your book title. It's easy to do. Simply call me and we'll brainstorm on a few ideas, and in a few hours, I'll whip something up and send you a digital file ready to use. Remember, call or text me, Randy James, at 214-762-1942.
Welcome to IndieLector.store, an online bookstore where the discriminating reader can find award-winning books. IndieLector.store is not a big corporation, so we can give up to 80% of the sales directly to the author. Help us support them by buying a great book at IndieLector.store.
Hello, I am the author and poet Denise Bryson. I am the author of The Things That Cross My Mind, Love's Reality, both in book and audio form. I am also noted as one of the best poets of 2011. I have two new projects coming up. One is the Blinky series, where Blinky tells us all about our coins and our bills for our children. I also have a book coming out called Say Ye. It's quotes from Denise Bryson, just inspirational and that will help you along the way.
Welcome back to Indie Beacon Radio. Don't forget to like us, follow us, or subscribe to one of our many channels. Now, here is your host for today's show.
And welcome back. This is your host, Alan Bourgeois with Indie Beacon Show, and we have with us John Noble. We were talking about how he got into writing at a young age throughout college and stuff. And in college, if I understand correctly, you became an engineer, correct?
Yes, I'm a mechanical engineer.
So it's interesting that you have a little bit of a scientific aspect and mechanical aspect to it, because your first book, The Days of Elijah, is totally different than your second book, Starbound. How did that happen, going from one to the other?
So it's kind of a complicated story. Basically, Starbound, which is my second published book, was actually written before I wrote The Days of Elijah. I'd always, so when I was a kid, my two favorite sets of books were, like, I really loved the high fantasy Redwall novels, and I loved anything science fiction. So I think I mentioned earlier that I started out writing Stargate fan fiction, which, if you know what Stargate is, basically like people go through wormholes to other planets and fight in spaceships and fight aliens. It's endlessly cool and fascinating. And so ever since I was a kid, I always wanted to tell a story like that. And my approach to it was a little different than some of what I'd seen. I felt like a lot of science fiction out there focused on it focused on things like space battles without really understanding how space battles would work. And so as an engineer, one of the things I really wanted to do was sit down and think through how this sort of stuff would work. And so part of my thinking through all that and trying to come up with what I consider to be a more realistic sci-fi story is what Starbound became. And so I put it on the back after I wrote it.
And you also chose to kind of keep it closer to Earth, because you were saying in your website that sci-fis tend to go out there way far away and stuff like that, but you wanted to keep it more closer to home, right?
Yeah, it was actually funny when after I wrote the book, I just started looking around one day, and I had a hard time finding like popular sci-fi books that didn't have aliens in them. And I never thought about it, because, like, well, of course, people go out into the galaxy and fight aliens and get plasma pistols and all this stuff, right? And it occurred to me, like, the space exploration that we have going on today, though, is nothing like that, because there are no aliens, at least that we've encountered yet. So the space exploration that we have today is is just kind of new territory. And the stuff that is done about space exploration today, like the movie Gravity, is typically more focused on, like, I don't know, it's just different, I guess. I wanted to write a military science fiction story set in space, but that wasn't focused on the aliens have this invincible armada, kind of like Halo, where the aliens are coming and we can't stop them. And so I tried to write something that was more rooted in current day geopolitics, just sort of extrapolated out to, in this case, like 30 or 40 years in the future.
Now, you're using a lot of references to sci-fi shows and books and stuff like that. So clearly you are a sci-fi fan. So with Starbound being done, are you working on a follow-up to it?
Yes, so that's my current project, is I'm writing a second book. So just to give a bit of a summary of what happens to explain the second book. In the first book, we have these two kids, Devin and Melissa. They are moving to Mars. Along the way, they stop at a space station in mid-Earth orbit, I guess. I think it's mid-Earth orbit. Anyway, stuff starts exploding. They get caught up in this basically invasion of the space station and have to try and fight their way out and try and survive. In the second book, they are actually on their way to Mars on a huge artificial gravity colony ship. And again, stuff starts exploding and life gets very interesting. So I'm hoping to do a 3-book trilogy in the end, and eventually it'll kind of end as they get to Mars, hopefully, if they get to Mars.
Okay, so we'll have to wait for the third book to find out.
Yeah, it should be interesting, I hope.
Okay. And do you have other story ideas you're working on or kind of milking in the back of your mind?
Well, yeah, I've got, the issue for me right now is, as an engineer, I work a lot, so I don't have as much time as I'd like to actually devote to all the projects that I could conceive of. But I've got 2 other kind of ideas floating in the background. One is a partially written story, which is basically what I did with the Days of Elijah, except with Joseph, who's a very, very Old Testament biblical character. And the other one is, I mentioned before that I have an epic fantasy trilogy kind of sitting around that I need to dust off. I wrote a spin-off book to that I would like to publish at some point, maybe along with the epic fantasy trilogy, but getting that all together and ready to go is just a huge undertaking that you can only do one thing at a time. So
right. Yeah, you definitely have a lot going on there, and a lot to come up with.
Too many things.
You had mentioned that you had tried to go the traditional publishing route, found that to be a challenge. What was the most challenging part for you?
So for me, I just couldn't get anyone to stop and take a look. I actually started trying to get Starbound traditionally published because, like I mentioned, it was written before the Days of Elijah. So I started out submitting it to agents, and I actually have a spreadsheet somewhere that I think has exactly 100 submissions that were varying levels of rejection. And so eventually I kind of just had this moment where it's like, well, God, like, why can't I get published? And I just, at the time, I ran across this other self-published author. His name was Nathan Van Coops. He writes time travel science fiction and also a random fantasy book. But I remember reading his stuff and thinking, like, man, this is really good. And I'd always had this idea that self-publishing was just a, kind of a cesspool. And I'd never realized, like, you can actually self-publish stuff and it can be good. And the thing was, he was doing well too. I'd always imagined that you self-publish and it's just like, yay, the book falls into the abyss. But it doesn't have to be that way. There's opportunities. And in my opinion, I was very blessed and very, very fortunate that the Days of Elijah did as well as it did, because my second book, Starbound, has frankly not done nearly as well. So there's a lot of, I guess, luck or something like that plays into it, timing, all sorts of stuff. But it opened my eyes to the fact that you could self-publish and do it well. I was like, well, I could try that. And so I sat down and started learning, and it was like a year or two after that before I actually published, but that was what kind of put me on the path to get going in that direction.
Now, by being self-published, do you mean you actually hired one of the companies to publish the book, or you did everything? You got the graphic artist, you set it up with Ingram and all that stuff. How did you do self-publishing?
I did all the legwork. I contracted out for both my covers, and actually the current cover of Starbound, I sat down 3 months, or the current. I've been experimenting with different covers, but several months ago I sat down and actually like made some of my own integrating parts of this cover. I took a Photoshop class in high school, so I had a basic idea of how to do it. It was just getting together the stock photography. But yeah, so I pretty much did everything along the way. And advertising, I kind of had to learn that from scratch, because I'd always assume like, oh, you self-publish, there's no way, I don't know how to promote myself. And I had to sit down and learn how to promote myself in ways that I could do. So for example, a lot of people use things like Twitter, and I don't use Twitter, partly because I'm afraid I would get in trouble on Twitter, and also just because I don't have time for it. Like, I work a lot. There's who has time for Twitter. So I've cut out some of the marketing channels that I know I can't use effectively, and tried to focus on the ones that I feel I can, which a lot of that's pay-per-click advertising, that sort of stuff. So, but yes, I've pretty much had to do everything on my own.
Well, with each book, you get better and better at it, right?
I hope so. It doesn't feel that way sometimes. Just a new set of problems, but maybe.
Well, even with COVID now, we're experiencing a change in the publishing world that's going to put us in a whole different aspect soon. So watch for that. It's all happening.
Really?
We are at that point where we do need to take another break for our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
Thank you for watching or listening to Indie Beacon Radio. Our sponsor, IndieLector.store, is the only bookstore that pays authors their fair share for book sales. Help authors to succeed and enjoy a great book by supporting them at IndieLector.store. Enjoy a 10% discount with coupon code SHOPPER20 at IndieLector.store. Coupon valid until December 31st, 2020. That's IndieLector.store, coupon code SHOPPER20.
The 5th Annual Authors Marketing Event. 2 days of live seminars in marketing for authors. The only organization that certifies authors in marketing. Live and free to the first 100 authors registered. Sponsored by Bubblish, empowering entrepreneurs, and Indie Lector Store, paying authors for their fair share. Head to www.2020.authorsmarketingguild.com today.
What started as a love letter to her son has become an international love letter for all parents to their children. Now you can read acclaimed author Shanalee Charbonneau's story to your children. When her son was very sick, she calmed him by singing her own song to him. She turned that song into the book, My Mama Loves Me, I'm Her Little Boy. She wrote 3 more magical books for all parents and kids 6 and under. Available at Indie Lector, Amazon, and all local and national outlets.
Authors Marketing Guild is a membership-owned organization designed to help authors succeed and learn how to better market and sell themselves and their books. Join us at authorsmarketingguild.com and receive so many benefits you'll wonder why you didn't join sooner. That's authorsmarketingguild.com.
Welcome back to Indie Beacon Radio. Don't forget to like us, follow us, or subscribe to one of our many channels. Now, here is your host for today's show.
And welcome back. This is your host, B. Alan Bourgeois. I am talking with John Noble on this edition of the Indie Beacon Show. And John has written 2 books. The first one that came out was Starbound, but also The Days of Elijah, which is his better novel, if you want to say that. It's selling better, let's put it that way. But there are 2 totally different types of books. And he's working on a 3rd one that is a sequel to Starbound and hopefully part of a trilogy and stuff. So, John, how can people find your books?
So the easiest way to find my books is on Amazon, and that's actually pretty much the only avenue. I think I have hard copies on Barnes & Noble, but mainly it's on Amazon.
Okay, and do you have a website?
I do. It is jnoblewrites.com, and yeah, you can go there, check it out. I tried to make the graphics look somewhat pretty, but I was a little limited by the website builder I used.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that you're not using much as far as social media. What social media do you use?
I really don't. So I have theoretically a Facebook page for the book, but that's mainly so that I can run Facebook advertisement, which the Facebook advertisement doesn't link back to the page at all. It links over to my Amazon page. So really my main online presence is either in my website, which, if you read through, actually, if you read my description or my bio on Amazon, it even points you to my website there. And that's my main avenue for trying to interact with readers.
Okay. And obviously the books are both available as print and ebooks. What about audio?
So The Days of Elijah, I did the hard work of getting that made into an audiobook last year. And so that one's available as an audiobook, but the reality is, for people that don't know, if you want to get an audiobook made and done semi-professionally, it easily costs at least $2,000 to $3,000. Unless you want to read it yourself, which I have no desire to read it myself, and I don't think anyone else has the desire to listen to me read it to them. So yeah, it gets very, very expensive. And typically what I do is I wait to see if I feel the book can justify the return, because I try to track pretty much everything and treat the author thing like a business, even if it doesn't make that much money. And so I tried to make sure that I wouldn't be just throwing money down the toilet on the audiobook thing before I actually go and do it. So
I understand. Now, with the sequel to Starbound, when are you hoping to have that released?
That I don't know. The biggest thing is just work, because currently I work in kind of a small town Kansas world doing environmental remediation, and that sucks up large portions of my day. So the time that I would like to be writing, half the time I come home and I just go to sleep. So that I don't know, probably in the next year or two, I hope. I'd prefer faster. The book itself is mostly written, but the editing takes time as well, and the writing process is understandably slow. So
now,
it may be a while.
While this is being recorded, of course, we're coming off of the COVID lockdown and stuff. Once we are back to a semi-normal situation, are you going to be out doing book festivals or signings or anything?
I debated doing that, and honestly, I don't know. I was kind of getting, that's where the poster came from. I was kind of getting geared up for doing something like that before COVID happened, and then I might. It really just depends. Because there's a lot of other legwork. Yeah, there's some other legwork that I still have to do to be able to do like in bookstore signings, and so at some point I may sit down and do that, but I don't know when exactly.
I understand. With the short time we have left, I always ask my guests if they have any words of advice for someone who wants to write.
I mean, I don't know. I suppose the biggest thing, at least for me, is you just have to take it kind of one paragraph at a time. Because like I said, I have days when I come home and I am absolutely drained and I can get a sentence or two out. And then I have other days where I come home and I can get 3 or 4 pages out. And you just have to make a habit of it almost. Like, you look at a book itself and you think this is an impossible task. And it is if you only have 2 hours. You can't do it. But if you look at it as, I just need to write 2 more paragraphs, or I need to finish this scene, or I need to get halfway through this chapter, it's a lot more doable. And for me, that's what's helped me keep writing, even in moments where it's like, I can't do this. So.
Good. Well, I want to thank you for being with us, and we'll definitely look forward to the sequel of Starbound, and we wish you the best of luck.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Indie Beacon Radio, where creative souls can find help in marketing their creations. To learn more about Indie Beacon services, to be a guest on the show, or to advertise on our show, please visit our website.
Indie Beacon Radio with the host, B. Alan Bourgeois. Indie Beacon Radio is produced by B. Alan Bourgeois for Authors Marketing Guild, LLC, copyright 2020. Voiceover by Randy James, Lydia Bello, and B. Alan Bourgeois. To be a sponsor of the show or for more information, please email us at info@authorsmarketingguild.com. To be interviewed for the show, please complete the form at radio.authorsmarketingguild.com. Music Always Rejoice by Ramcord